Welcome to Marriage Matters with host
Bryant?
and Shonda Wright.
Welcome to Marriage Matters.
For your marriage matters to us.
I'm Bryant.
And I'm Chanda. We're the
Right.
hosts.
Right.
Right?
Right.
Right. Today we're talking about, what you say?
I don't want to talk about it.
What you mean you don't want to talk about it?
I don't want to talk about it.
What you say?
I don't want to talk about it.
Well, what's wrong with you?
There ain't nothing wrong with me. I don't want to talk about it.
You don't want to talk about it. Why is that always the go-to for men?
It's a safe place.
How's that safe? You have to communicate. I think that's a bit immature place.
Whoa, 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 whoa.
Oh,
whoa.
I'm sorry. Did
You
I say
didn't
something wrong?
Yeah, I want to talk about it. No.
Oh, now you want to talk about it, huh?
Well, see, when a man says something, whatever he says is going to be wrong. I don't want to talk about it.
What you mean you don't want to talk about it?
Okay, we're talking about communication today. As you can tell, I'm the crazy one out the bunch. She's the more serious one.
Yes, so you got to have good, effective communication.
Good, effective communication is the key to get an understanding in a relationship. And if you don't want to talk about it, like most men a lot of times don't want to talk about it, it's what I like to call, you have a translator who will talk about it.
Yeah.
Which is the enemy, which will tell your spouse what you're thinking and what you're feeling. So it's a good idea to have open dialogue or lines of communication, whether it's verbal,
Nonverbal,
whether it's written,
or visual. Those are the four main types of communication. Written communication includes
text,
emails,
note, handwritten note,
letters, it's the same thing, books, magazines, anything written, just about.
to get your point across.
Right. Verbal communication is, of course,
I don't want to talk about it.
not that. That's nonverbal.
Verbal communication is audible, it's speaking.
And visual communication.
I like visual communication.
Yes.
It all depends. If your mouth stuck out and you mad, or whatever the case, I don't like that visual communication.
So if you don't know what's wrong, how can you fix it? If you don't communicate, you don't know what's wrong, how can you fix it?
If you don't communicate, you can't fix it. The thing is, it's just gonna get worse. Sweeping it under the rug, never removed any trash or whatever the case may be that was on the floor. I mean, it just compounds the problem, and sooner or later you will see it again.
Yeah, of course. Don't I know it? It's what, 28 years later?
I won't talk about it.
Yeah, we've been together 28 years. It'll be our 25th anniversary this year. And communication is still a big sticking point. And I tell people all the time,
It's a work in progress.
a constant work in
A
progress.
work in progress.
Constantly.
You have to be willing with your communication to be vulnerable. If you're not willing to be vulnerable in your communication, then you're going to have a problem, a huge problem. Putting your pride to the side and expressing what you're feeling or what you felt about a situation is key.
Yes, we have to communicate in a way that our spouses or whoever you're speaking to can understand.
Can receive it.
Right. So as we talk about communication, verbal communication, I like to talk about verbal abuse. Verbal abuse is tough because a lot of times it's happening unintentionally. And so when it's done unintentionally, the person doesn't even know that they're being verbally abusive. And even once it's pointed out or you put your finger on it, they're still sometimes in denial.
Because nobody want to feel like, no one in their right mind want to feel like they're being abusive or they are abuser, you know what I'm saying? Whatever the case may be. So sometimes they'll shy away from that, like, wait a minute, what you mean? You know, like, I'm abusive or whatever the case may be.
But a lot of times, especially in our culture, we've gotten to be comfortable with verbal abuse. So that's why we don't recognize it in our marriages, because we were raised sometime in such a way that...
Dysfunctional homes. And I just want to clarify, verbal abuse is not just limited to a man abusing a woman, but also women can also be verbally abusive to their husband.
Definitely. Hence the angry black woman or the mad black woman. And verbal abuse, just to give a example, is being criticizing, insulting, hurtful words used against another.
Overly critical.
Yes. It's a difference between constructive criticism and being very critical about your spouse.
Or being demeaning about your spouse, beating your spouse down over, I mean, it shouldn't be, it's not necessary, period. It doesn't make a difference what you're facing or what the issue may be. We have to learn to effectively communicate how we're feeling. God dealt with me about it, and at times what it is you have grown men and women throwing tantrums.
True.
Throwing tantrums because I can't get my way, so now I'm going to say whatever it is I want to say, and I'll say it however I feel like saying it because I can't get my way. So we have to figure out a way to respectfully communicate how we're feeling. That goes back to being vulnerable. So you have to be a man or a woman, put your big boy drawers on or your big girl drawers on or whatever the case may be, and say how you felt in that moment, and not, lash out on your spouse.
Right, and you keep saying that word, vulnerable. That is very important to understand, that communicating and being vulnerable in your communication is very important, because if you don't, you will come off more than likely
abusive.
Yes, out of anger and out of your emotions. So you won't communicate effectively. You'll more likely cause more harm than good, and that will cause emotional pain and distress to that relationship, and it can be a big factor and a disconnect in that relationship as well.
In some cases, when you communicate out of vulnerability, it can also disarm the spouse. When you tell that spouse, the spouse that really cares, if you tell that spouse, this is how you made me feel in that moment, then they can get an understanding of where you're coming from, let alone just lashing out because, okay, you made me feel like this way. So generally, hurt people want to hurt people. So since you made me feel like this or less than a man, so now I'm going to make you feel less than a woman or whatever the case may be because I'm hurt or I'm wounded or whatever the case, instead of just verbalizing the fact that this hurt me.
Right. And again, because of the dysfunction sometime of the past and the culture and the environment that we were raised in, it's normal to be verbally abusive. It's normal to, if someone hurt your feelings, to curse them out or yell and scream and throw a tantrum, to express how you felt in that moment.
It may be normal, but it's not right.
Correct.
It's not right. The Bible says that a soft answer turning away wrath. And a lot of times we behave in a manner of what we grew up in. And I've seen where mothers cuss their kids out or whatever the case may be. And before my mother got saved when I was younger, it happened with me or whatever the case may be. I'm pretty sure it happened in your household or whatever the case may be. But just because it happened or you experienced it or you seen it, it doesn't make it right.
Correct. And here's something I want people to know. Verbal abuse is just as detrimental as physical abuse. That's something we don't know. Like we say, the saying, sticks and stones may break your bones, but words will never hurt you. That is not correct, because words can leave bruises or injuries that don't heal for many, 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 many years. And if you don't get help in those situations, then it could possibly last a lifetime. Something somebody said to you that hurt you or wounded you, and every time in your life you hear those words or hear anything similar to that, it triggers that time in your life where you were wounded and that the wound has never healed, so you act out or respond out of your emotions or anger.
That could be the root cause of a lot of things, and people will bring in inferiority complex or whatever the case may be, where people think that they're not good enough or whatever the case may be. And even when your spouse goes to make you just give you positive reinforcement, sometimes it won't be received because of what you've been through, the negative communication that you're used to. And so, like a husband telling a wife, you know, you're beautiful, and the wife doesn't believe it because you come from a background where the communication was so toxic that you were told that you were ugly. So now when the husband tells you, or whatever the case may, or vice versa, it could be the other way around, you don't receive it because of where you came from, the places and the spaces where you came from.
Yeah, true. So words can do a lot of damage, and words can be healing also. There's, two sides to that coin of communication when it's done properly.
Which is true.
So when you're mature enough to have a real adult conversation.
Did you say adult conversation?
That's what I said.
Wait a minute, what do you mean the adult conversation? What you trying to say on an adult? Because I said I don't want to talk about it in an adult conversation.
That's right. That's immaturity at its finest.
That's healthy conversation.
How's that healthy?
Because I ain't got to say nothing wrong.
No, we're going to talk about that too, but guess what? It's not healthy.
What you mean it's not healthy?
How is it healthy?
Because if I ain't, what you ever told, if you ain't got nothing good to say, don't say nothing at all. So I ain't saying nothing at all.
There's a time and a place for everything. And for you to not say anything at all in your marriage, come on now.
But on the serious side, I think you're right. What you said is a time and place for everything, because you have to, if you're in a heated moment or whatever the case may be, you will say something. You do have to communicate to the spouse that this is not the time for this conversation. However, that conversation needs to be had at a later date or a later time when both spouses have calmed down and cooler heads, to allow cooler heads to prevail, to have a conversation.
The adult conversation, not the immature one you was having before out your emotions.
The adult
You
conversation.
know what I'm saying? Now you know what I'm talking about.
Huh?
There's a difference between an mature adult conversation, because we can be adults and not have an adult conversation. You know what I mean?
No, adult, you hear it all the time. I'm an adult. I could do what I'm head popping, eye roll. I'm an adult. This is adult conversation. I'm grown. I'm over 21 and potty trained, so this is adult conversation, and I don't want to talk about it.
That's why I added the word mature, because you need to have a mature adult conversation.
Mature? Yes,
There's
mature.
a
Mature
There's
conversation.
a difference.
I can hold one of those.
Then we're going to talk about listen-only mode, because listening is a great part of communication.
Listening is a huge part of communication, and most of the time, people do not listen to hear. People listen to have a rebuttal. So I think listening is a very important part of communication.
Very much so, that the scripture also says, be quick to listen,
Yeah?
slow to speak. Could you hear me?
A little bit.
Are you listening?
I'm understanding.
Are you listening?
Maybe.
I don't think you're listening. I don't think you heard me. But listen only mode. So that's very important in communication, that we learn to listen, to understand, and not just respond or to come back and make your point or to.
But I got to know how to defend myself.
Why would you have to defend yourself with your spouse, though? They're not the enemy.
Because you said something that might have been hurt.
But then that goes back again to having an adult, a mature adult conversation.
I gotta think on that.
If we're having a mature adult conversation, you're not going to be saying those aggressive
And hurtful.
comments that's going to damage the person. In a mature adult conversation, you're going to be more vulnerable than anything.
Which is true, and that's when listening comes in, and you're able to hear what your spouse had to say. I mean, if you love somebody, you should want to hear their heart and understand what's ailing them or what's going on with them.
And even sometimes in those verbal abusive conversations, if you do step back and get a chance to kind of, think about it or see if it was anything, important or true during those times. Not most people not likely to do that.
You won't be able to hear past the insults, or whatever the case may be. So you fighting against your own. What's my favorite line?
Cause.
You're fighting against your own cause when you entertain or you begin to take part in a verbally abusive communication, because I'm not going to hear what you got to say. Most people 9 times out of 10 going to shut down when it's a verbally abusive conversation.
So there's no such thing as listen-only mode.
Not in that setting.
You may get quiet, but you're not listening necessarily. Just because they're quiet, because you're being insulting or combative or whatever you want to call it, doesn't mean they're listening.
And not just that far as listening, but being mature. You have to be able to stop and just say, did I hear you right? Did I hear you correctly? Because this is what I heard out of what you said, and I need to know, did you mean it this way? It's a few times that we had conversations, and I'm like, wait a minute, this is what I heard or whatever.
You said, what you say?
Yeah.
A few times.
A few times.
Like, what you say?
No, yeah, I got to get understanding, because if I go by how I perceived it, then I can get angry and shut down, or or vice versa. So I need clarification. Is this what you were shooting for? This what you was aiming for? Whatever the case may be, or this what you meant? So that part about having that in listen only mode and having a mature conversation is being able to just stop for a minute, and say, instead of you lashing out, like, is this what you meant in that moment? Being vulnerable instead of being prideful and trying to strike back. Yes, I'm such a good husband.
Oh, my bad.
Wait a minute. Oh, no. Huh?
You are a good husband. You know that.
We going to the next topic?
You work my nerves. But I still love you. Yeah, so that's a good point, though. We will discuss nonverbal communication and how that works or it doesn't work. With nonverbal communication, and my husband says it all the time about your facial expressions, like he don't know what his face might be saying when he thinking he handled the situation in an adult, mature manner, or correctly, but he say he don't know his face might have said something else.
Well, I just can say this. I do not have a poker face. Usually how I'm feeling, although I don't want it to, it generally shows itself.
And your facial expression, which is a form of nonverbal communication. Your
Nonverbal cue.
Your facial expressions, rolling of the eyes, rolling of the neck, pointing of the fingers, and
The snapping of the finger.
Yeah, yeah, all that non-verbal communication. And when we talked about verbal communication, we talked about verbal abuse. Now, non-verbal communication, there's this thing called the silent treatment.
So
That's
you ain't gotta
another
say,
form.
I ain't gotta say, I don't want to talk about it.
Well, the silent treatment is another form of abuse.
So
It's
you mean to tell me because I don't want to say anything that's a form of verbal abuse? I mean, it's a form of abuse?
Yes, that's a form of nonverbal abuse. You got verbal abuse and you have nonverbal abuse. Nonverbal abuse shows up in the silent, what we call the silent treatment.
So if I don't want to talk about it and don't want to say anything, I'm being abusive.
To a certain degree. What happens is, again, there's a time and a place for everything. So there's a time maybe when the spouse is being insulting and, yelling and screaming and demeaning. Of course you don't want to talk about it, and you take a pause and you step away and you come back when you can have a better conversation.
So that means
But the silent treatment,
going a day without speaking to you?
right now,
2 days without speaking to you?
yes, in 2 weeks, in 3 weeks, in a month, without even speaking to your spouse. That's abuse.
So you saying to the women and the men out there that's not permissible?
That's what I said.
Ooh.
I said what I said.
Ooh.
That's exactly what I said. If you're running around here giving your spouse the silent treatment, meaning not speaking to them for months or weeks or days at a time, you're being abusive to your spouse. It's called nonverbal abuse.
Is it called punishment? So in other words, you punishing your spouse because you didn't get your way. So is that another form of the silent form of throwing a tantrum?
Exactly.
Grown folks throw tantrums?
Exactly. You know that.
I don't want to talk about it.
You know that. So the silent treatment is not an option. It's not, when I say silent treatment, again, silent treatment is different from saying pause or being silent in a verbal abusive situation. There's a difference. The silent treatment goes on for days and weeks and months versus you take a pause in an verbally abusive or aggressive situation.
Or a situation that could escalate.
Right. You pause to keep the peace or to keep the situation from escalating. That's not abusive.
So, okay. So what about when the man don't want to talk at that particular time and the woman, or it could be vice versa, forcing he or she to talk? If it can go either way. But he's trying to walk away.
Are they putting a gun to your head?
No, but he's trying to walk away from the situation, to diffuse it at that point in time, and he can't get any space or can't get a break because somebody's blocking his path.
That goes back to the immature spouse, not understanding or knowing the difference. Now, what I do hear a lot is that men will say, I don't want to talk about it, but never want to talk about it. So it's a difference when you say, I don't want to talk about it, and the spouse knows that at a later time, when you calm down or you had a chance to process it, that you're ready to talk.
But again, that goes back to maturity in the communication. When the man is not ready to talk, then if he's trying to walk away from a situation, he needs to be allowed to walk away.
Definitely. But that goes back to understanding. That goes back to what we always teach. Marriages fail for a lack of knowledge. You got to understand that. But when you've come from an verbally abusive background, you're used to being aggressive sometime like that. You're not used to or understand that.
You're used to toxic answers.
Right. So you're not understanding when I say I don't want to talk about it, that I'm saying that to keep the peace and to keep it from becoming a bigger problem than it already is. Right.
So you cannot want to talk about it as long as it doesn't linger on in that moment. In other words, what we're saying is an option. If you don't want it to escalate to something else, there's no need to talk about it.
Yeah. And when I talk to wives, they always say, well, not always, but when they say things like, my husband really was getting on my nerves and he was doing the most, or he was this, that, and the other, but I didn't say anything. And so what that means is either you're giving the silent treatment,
Nonverbal communication.
or you doing some nonverbal communication. You probably did use words.
He getting the cold shoulder. He getting the stare of death. He's in the shadow of death and don't even know. Or maybe he do.
And one thing you have to know, your silence speaks loudly.
Facts.
Silence speaks loudly. Even when we were saying about the adversary, the enemy. You know, when you're not speaking, he's speaking. He's telling your spouse they don't love you, they don't care, they don't this, they don't that, you know, type thing. He's telling them in that instance they don't love you. They don't take your feelings into consideration.
He has a lot that he adds to a situation, and he has a lot to say, and it's best for us to be mature in order to keep the enemy out of our relationship.
Very important. It's very important to communicate. Communication is key. Communication will not destroy your marriage, but it can be destroying to a marriage.
I think I want to talk about it.
Oh, you want to talk about it now, huh? You're such a good husband. Well, let's talk about it then. Let's talk about the toilet seat being left up. Oh, you didn't mean that? You didn't mean that?
Let's talk about it.
What you meant when you said let's talk about it? Go ahead.
The toilet seat?
Yeah.
We'll talk about it next time.
Ah, really? I thought you said you wanted to talk about it.
We'll talk about it.
You can't have an adult conversation about it now. You got to think about it.
I'm pondering what I want to say.
Well, at least you're willing to talk about
Before
it.
I start to pontificate.
Joker.
You asked me to talk about it.
Right, right. But you trying to be funny now.
Tune in next time
To Marriage Matters
with your host, Brian.
and Chanda Wright.
Right.
Right. Right.
Marriage Matters, a production of World Outreach Conference Center, located 4 East 111th Street, Chicago, Illinois, 60628. Phone number 773-264-2588. Bryant Wright, Shonda Wright, executive producers, DM Blossom, producer. Thanks for tuning in.